Welcome, and this is it. This is the last lecture on the book. This is the last two, these are the last two sections, and this lecture will cover the last two sections of chapter 40, which looks at the global problems that happen in the age of globalization. So these are contemporary problems that are ongoing. And the information, like I mentioned before, in this chapter is going to be ever changing. Some of the things that were problems may be working on solutions now, some might be getting worse. So a lot of the environmental problems can be tied to population. And in the age of globalization, global problems require global solutions because the actions of every country have an impact on the world. It takes the world to solve them. One country can't do it alone. So to give you some context, the world didn't reach 1 billion people until around the year 1804. And by 1927, there was 2 billion. In 1950, the world had 2.5 billion people. By 1994, it had 5.5 billion people. In 2012, we reached 7 billion people. And by 2024, we will be at 8 billion. So something that took all of humanity up until the year 1800 to do, we've since done it 7 more times. And so that's brought up concerns over the Earth's carrying capacity. Do we have enough resources to feed this population? Population is at the root of the environmental problems. It's challenging biodiversity because we are, to consume resources, we deforest, we cut down plants, we destroy habitat. There are thousands of species who are on the verge of extinction, and that poses a problem in the ability of the planet to sustain life. We have used technology to try to overcome some challenges, yet we still need to be cautious of what we're going to be doing in the future. And another big challenge is global warming. Our activities are contributing to warmer climates, and that's changing global climate patterns. That has the potential to impact our planet's ability to grow food, to provide the vegetation that either we need for fruits and vegetables or that the animals that we consume need. More people also means we use more of those resources. We have overfished the oceans. There are a lot of places in the ocean that no longer have the ability to self-sustain, to replace what we've taken out. We have overfished a lot of the world's oceans. And so all of these require global solutions. And the first big step towards obtaining that were the Kyoto agreements that were signed in Kyoto, Japan. And that's where countries from around the world kind of came to an agreement of what they're going to do, what every country is going to contribute to try to contain the emission of greenhouse gases. But despite that attempt, it's up to individual countries to really implement the changes they say they're going to do, and there's no accountability if they don't do it. It makes it challenging when not everybody believes the science behind climate change, and that has an impact on policies because sometimes we tend to put dollars ahead of science, and that happens throughout the world. So that's another major challenge. Another one is with population control. And when we talk about overpopulation, what does that mean? When you say overpopulation, you're saying that there are too many people. So who exactly would be the too many? Are the too many people the Americans that are living here? Are they the Mexicans that are living in Mexico? Are they the Indians that are living in India? Right? So there is a little bit of imperialism and racism that's tied to that term overpopulation because it's used often in industrialized countries to talk about the population growing a lot in the non-industrialized world. And sometimes a child born in an industrialized country over the course of their lifetime will actually contribute more to environmental degradation because of their consumption patterns than somebody born in a developing nation. And so there was pressure on developing countries to control the population growth, Countries started focusing now on the health of the population. There was a while where countries were not really taking this seriously, and they were actually encouraging people to continue to have children. Right, there are some countries that went on campaigns to try to get more people to have children because they felt that the larger your population, the more powerful your country could be. Now countries are aware of the challenge that come with having a large population, especially when there's not a lot of economic opportunity. 80 countries have adopted birth control programs. One of the more extreme ones was China's one child policy. But there have also been some challenges to population control programs, especially religion and politics. In some cases, religious leaders are against the use of contraception, as they find getting pregnant is something that is God's wishes. And so by using birth control, you're going against God's wishes. And so in countries like that, there have been a lot more resistance to the measures of implementing birth control, providing contraception, sexual education, condoms, etc. And then in others, it's been politics. It's the politics of letting people choose, letting people decide what they're going to do. Um, all of these are challenges, but today there are a lot of efforts to educate the population better on child rearing and on trying to reduce the size of families so that the population growth is a little bit more steady. With a larger population, there's a strain on resources, there's also a strain on jobs, and poverty contributes a lot to malnutrition, lower life expectancies, and these are the economic inequities that come along with poverty, as well as the labor servitude. This map here shows the percentage of the population in the world that lives off of less than $1.90 a day. And the darker the orange, the more that you have a percentage of the population that lives off $1 a day. You can see in some countries, it's hard to see the number, but it's as much as 60%. So that's something that's pretty major. As a result of this poverty, malnutrition among the poor has led to starvation, it's led to death. There's poor mental development, higher rates of infection, mental disorders, organ damage, vision failing among poor children and adults. And this has to do because people don't have adequate nutrition, adequate shelter, lack of running water, sometimes absence of sewage facilities. So they're more exposed to bacteria, to viruses that are carried by people, by insects and rodents. So poverty is in a lot of places, an early death sentences. The average infant mortality rates are higher and there's lower life expectancies because of this. So the causes of poverty, one of those causes is the uneven distribution of resources. Some parts of the world have access to better land for farming, better natural resources that led to economic development. But another aspect has been 500 years of colonialism, because there are places that had natural resources, but because of the practices of imperialism that begin with the Europeans exploring the Americas, it put them in control of those resources. It led to the wealth growing in the colonizing countries and a stagnation of wealth in the colonies. And that was a practice that went on for 500 years. So that's another cause of that. If you take a look at a map showing the countries that first began to establish colonies, it pretty much coincides with the countries that today are the industrialized countries, that are the countries that have a lot stronger economies. And so there are some countries that have been able to diversify their economy. South Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, they all have been able to develop economic systems where they've now been able to thrive economically and develop a lot of wealth. But in general, globalization has led to the wealthier countries becoming wealthier, and the poorer countries, even though they're seeing development within those countries, not everyone is experiencing that wealth. So the people who are poor are becoming poorer, although we have lowered the amount of the percentage of people that live in poverty has been declining. So, but there are challenges, and one of those challenges is labor servitude. Poor economic conditions have been closely associated with forms of servitude that are similar to slavery. And even though slavery has been abolished, there are other types of practices that continue to affect poor people in developing countries because of the need for work, because of the desperation for jobs. So, a growing related problem is trafficking of people. And that's a form of modern slavery. Between 1 to 2 million human beings annually are bought and sold across international and national boundaries. And so there's different types of trafficking. People are lured to, some countries by criminals with, who tell them there's a job opportunity. When they go to that country, they end up enslaved. There have been slaves found here in the United States. Back when I was in college, there was a factory making clothing in Los Angeles that had people that were being chained to the machines. They had been brought over from China with the promise that they were going to um, come to the United States to study and that they would pay for their education. In other places, they lure people in with sex trafficking, that they will provide money for the families if this young girl comes over here to do some modeling, and then they sell them into sex trafficking with criminal organizations that that they force women to sell their bodies for money. They threaten them with violence, they rape them, they torture them, they starve them, they incarcerate them. Oftentimes they get killed. And that's something that happens here in San Diego. There is a lot of sex trafficking that happens here because of the international border. So that's a big issue that we're still fighting with today. And even students at Southwest there have been students who have had family members or who themselves have been either abducted or attempted to be abducted. So it is something that touches every corner, not just the poor countries. Child labor is another form of labor servitude. 250 million children around the world between the ages of 5 and 14 work out of necessity. So those are things that are associated with poverty. And even, when we talk about crime is a way of trying to make income illegally because there's not enough legal venues for you to make a decent living. Another impact is global diseases. We started seeing this in the 1918-19 Spanish flu pandemic. Soldiers returning from World War I were carrying the virus home, and how fast a disease spread around the world. 20 to 40 million people died in that epidemic, in that pandemic. More people than died in World War I. However, we have used science and technology to make advances. We've eradicated smallpox and diphtheria, developed vaccines for different diseases. So we have been able to make some front on some diseases. However, new diseases have emerged. Some are diseases that are associated with poverty. Things like Ebola, AIDS, HIV are connected to poverty because of either ignorance from lack of education, the cost of drugs to treat infections, and ignorance, just not understanding the disease enough. And that goes along with, again, lack of education. So poverty is a factor in the spread of some diseases. There are other diseases that are lifestyle diseases. Countries that are industrialized, like in the United States, heart disease is a big one here in the United States, Alzheimer's, because they're associated with lifestyles and diets and eating the wrong foods. Um, in terms of AIDS, Africa has been struck the hardest with the AIDS cases, followed by India is another country that's been heavily impacted. And you can see the map there, the share of women among the population living with HIV. And it's major in Africa because there's millions of children that are born with HIV already because of the mothers. So it hits them hard because either they are left orphans because their parents die of HIV or AIDS, or they themselves will die of it because they are born with the disease. And so that has a big economic impact. That countries that are trying to come out of poverty, families that are trying to come out of poverty, end up getting stuck paying for expensive medication. And those governments that don't have enough money to help their people, it ends up creating just this spiral where your economy just gets stuck and you're not able to to grow in a time where your economy could be growing. Another major challenge is global terrorism. Terrorism um, is carried out by groups of people who are attempting to destabilize or overthrow political systems, whether it's international systems or whether it's within their own countries. And terrorism has been used in anti-colonial conflicts, in ethnic conflicts, and religious conflicts. And the big, dilemma here, and the book talks about it, is what is terrorism, right? Who gets to call it terrorism and who doesn't? People brought up the question where if a bomb from a military jet bombs a hospital and kills innocent people, is that terrorism, right? Is that any different from a plane flying into the Twin Towers? So technology in the age of globalization has allowed terrorist organizations to go global. They have the means to communicate and spread their networks around the world. They're able to recruit people online that live in different countries to carry out attacks in different countries. People become radicalized on certain networks. The 9/11 attacks on the United States on September 11th, 2001, hijackers, they flew planes into the Twin Towers. They flew another one into the Pentagon. And that killed almost over 3,000 Americans total. And it led to the beginning of this war on terror under President George W. Bush. He began this concept, which some people call the Bush Doctrine, of preemptive war. We're going to take the war to you before you bring it to us. So the idea was that there are countries that are harboring terrorists. There are countries that are allowing terrorists to train. So rather than wait for those terrorists to plan an attack, the United States was going to go into those countries to try to remove those terrorists. That hasn't been very successful. This begins in 2001, 2002, and to this day we still have troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. The United States went into Afghanistan to remove the Taliban, dealt them a blow, formed an alliance with the Northern Alliance, but this group that the U.S. supports there has not been able to gain control of the country of Afghanistan. And in recent years, the Taliban has been getting stronger. In addition, there's been more terrorist groups popping out in Iraq. Under Saddam Hussein, Iraq was a dictatorship, but it was kept in check by a dictator. Since the United States removed Saddam Hussein, Iraq has fallen into civil war, and it has been a breeding ground for terrorists. This is where ISIS has grown out of. ISIS didn't exist before. And so it's also costing the United States a lot of money. We've spent over $2 trillion now on operation costs funding the war on terror. And there's estimates that the United States' war on terror and the actions of the United States in the Middle East have displaced 37 million people. So 37 million people have had their lives uprooted because of this. And so some people in the United States question that. Some people are very, very supportive, saying, hey, they killed 3,000 Americans. Some people don't care that 37 million people are affected. And other people say, wait a minute, we're displacing 37 million people. That's creating more hatred towards the United States. That doesn't help us fight terror. That helps people that are terrorists gain more support. So those are different sides to that debate when it comes to global terrorism. And this concept, can you fight a war on someone that doesn't have an army? And that's the other aspect of terrorism. Terrorists target civilian populations. Their attempt is to create instability, to create panic, to create fear, distrust in the government, and there's targeting of civilians to make people feel like you're never going to feel safe. So, since there is no army, one country you could associate it with, and with technology, terrorists are able to spread throughout the world. How do you really fight this concept? And if you're going to be in perpetual war, is the society going to have a strong enough economy to meet the demands of the war, at the same time meet the demands of their civilian population, their domestic policies? And in the United States, we are at the point where our national debt is astronomically high, and we are cutting and cutting domestic programs. We are not able to provide for a lot of things for the people in our country, only the people that have good jobs. So it's leading to more social inequality, and history shows us that social inequality is often a recipe for social unrest. Now, in order to cope with the problems, global problems, we have seen the development of international organizations. Countries are cooperating now more than ever, but it takes a lot of will from countries, especially powerful countries. Countries like the United States, like Germany, like Japan, like China, like Russia. Those countries, if they can get their goodwill together, they have the power to influence a lot of other smaller countries. In addition to countries working together in organizations like the United Nations, you also have NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that focus on specific aspects. The Red Cross focuses on providing medical relief, right? And so this international symbol of the Red Cross is something that is used to identify non-combatants when it comes to conflicts, of people who are there to help civilians in areas of crisis. Greenpeace is an organization that works on environmental issues, trying to promote more environmental friendly policies, better treatment of animals. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch are organizations that help bring awareness and solve human rights crises around the world. In addition, the United Nations has the branch of the World Health Organization. We've seen this in this COVID pandemic, the World Health Organization bringing research and science together from all over the world to help develop vaccines, to help develop tests to test for COVID. And they've done this with other diseases. When there's an outbreak of Ebola, the World Health Organization helps bring the world's doctors to collaborate to try to help out in situations of crisis. And after World War II, the world also began to start developing an interest in human rights. A lot of it was influenced by the atrocities that were committed by the Nazis during the Holocaust. And the Nuremberg trials of the Nazis that were involved in the Holocaust, for the first time, brought up this charge of a crime against humanity. And it began to discuss, are there rights that humans make? Do we have the rights? And it's basically us as humans determine these rights. We name what we believe every person should have. And so a few years after, the UN drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so human rights have become a focal point a lot in international politics. And it isn't perfect, but for now, it's a step in the right direction, right? We've come closer than ever to providing rights for all people. And now Section 4 talked about crossing boundaries, and it focuses a lot on women and how the role of women has changed in this globalizing context. So women's traditions and feminist challenges is the first subsection. Women's status changed after World War II as more women participated in the workforce. But even though women were participating and even though women had gained the right to vote, the movement towards equal rights of being treated completely equally, economically, culturally, socially, has been very slow. There is a challenge to thousands of years of culture and patriarchal traditions. So 40 to 50% of the workforce in industrialized nations is female. However, not everywhere is the pay the same. So even where they do have, a fair representation in employment, oftentimes wages are not the same. In a lot of countries, women are still paid a lot less than men. And again, they're still challenging cultural and patriarchal traditions of women being at home. In the 1960s, you began to see the rise of the feminist movement that was fueled by workplace discrimination. So women were being given jobs, but they were being harassed or not paid the same, not given promotions. And so women began to demand full control of their bodies, equal employment, equal pay for equal work. Books like The Feminine Mystique became very influential in the feminist movement. And women felt that until women have full control of their bodies and their reproductive rights, there cannot be equality. And so the reason why the abortion issue is so big is because it's about a woman's right to choose. And sexism has been tied to biology, right? The idea that women have children and men don't means that women's bodies have to be controlled for the families, in the patriarchal structure. If, a man wants to have a baby, right, he obviously has to get the woman pregnant. And so that for thousands of years has given men control over women's bodies. And so this idea that a woman should be able to choose when if she gets pregnant because she doesn't have birth control, she's the one that is impacted. She's the one that has to take the time off work. The male doesn't. So women want full control of their bodies and their reproductive rights. And in some countries, that doesn't exist. In some countries, men are allowed to rape their wives. In some countries, women are, still being married very young by force and by family contracts. So in those situations, there is no control. In the United States, the U.S. Civil Rights Act in 1964 gave women equal protection under the law in employment. However, there was an attempt to pass the Equal Rights Amendment to make women fully equal in every aspect. That didn't pass. That failed to ratify. And there was given a deadline of 1982, and it was not, it required the states to pass it, and then they needed one state, and they couldn't get the last state to pass the ratification. That state finally passed it last year, 2020, I believe it was, or maybe it was 2019. But because the stature to the time frame given from the time the amendment was proposed, because it didn't pass in time, even though this last state passed it, they would have to start all over. So the Supreme Court said, no, we're not gonna extend that deadline. So there's still no amendment granting women full equality in the United States. China, right, bragged about equality. We saw this a little bit in the DBQ that we discussed last week, right? Communist leader Mao Zedong talked about women holding up half of the sky. Communism led to improvements in the rights on paper for women. It abolished child betrothal. Parents could not promise their daughters to someone else. A woman gets to choose a marriage, not the family. It also protected women's property rights, that the property belongs to her, not her husband. Women gained positions in government, but critics point to the actual practices. They were still locked out of the high positions in government. They could not get high government posts. And in addition, there was a lot of unintended consequences of the one-child policy. When you had the one-child policy in China, because of thousands of years of Confucian and Neo-Confucian family patriarchal structures where men are more valued, a woman, when she is married, goes to live with her husband and his family, which meant if you have a daughter, she's not going to take care of you when you're older. And if you can only have one child, a daughter means you're going to be alone when you're old. A son means he'll be married and bring a daughter into your home to help care for you as well in your old age. So as a result, people were preferring male children, and often if they knew the baby was going to be female, they would either abort the baby or they would let the baby die. They practiced infanticide. And so one of the unintended consequences is that there are millions and millions and millions more men in China today than women. There are an estimated 40 million men in China who will not be able to find a woman. Like if every single man in China was paired up with a woman, there would be 40 million men with no partner. And that, either they're going to go to other countries to find women, it's going to lead to, more sexual violence when men want to have a partner and there isn't a woman around. There's also a lot of women who are highly educated, and because of the patriarchal views of the Chinese still, there are women who won't find men because Men won't want a woman that makes more money, that is more educated than they are, or sometimes a woman won't want to marry a man who is of a very different social class and social and educational standing than her. So those are challenges that are socially going on in China today. So, in addition, there's been this continuing expectation of domesticity, of women to be in the household. A lot of women still are employed, something that requires them to be home or in farming. Many women are denied education, and education is the number one way that's proven to improve the economic status of a country, is educating the women. Countries that have high rates of illiteracy for females also have a lot of poverty. In Arab and Muslim countries, there are some countries where there's higher rates of illiteracy because they don't allow women to go to school. Improvements have been made, but it wasn't just till a few years ago that women were allowed to drive in a country like Saudi Arabia. In India, women remain in the home in many areas. So even though there are a lot of jobs, not a lot of women take the jobs or are allowed to. They still practice dowry deaths. A dowry death is when a husband feels that the wife's dowry was just not enough, they weren't satisfied, and they find another woman that they want to be with that has a better dowry. A dowry is a gift that your family gives you when you get married. Oftentimes they douse the woman with kerosene or with gasoline and they light her on fire to make it look like she had a cooking accident. And that way they could divorce her without having to give back the dowry that she brought with her to the marriage. So activists continue to challenge these practices, and activists around the world continue to fight for women's rights. If you've ever read the story of Malala got shot, survived, because she wanted to get an education and she wanted girls to have an education. So those are fights that are continuing to go on today throughout the world. And there have been some progresses, there have been some women leaders, but that isn't, the end of the whole story, right? And some of the early leaders, the heads of state, came from political families, right? Indira Gandhi was Nehru's daughter. And so Benazir Bhutto came from a political family. She was the president of Pakistan. And when your book was written, she was actually killed a year after your book was written. So when you read it in her book, it has her birth year, but it doesn't have her. She died in 2007. Your book was published in 2006. Chandrika Bandaranaike, I can't say that middle name, Kumara Ratunga, and her mom were both from a family in Sri Lanka that was a political family that they gotten from her father and the grandfather. In Myanmar, they also have a female president. And you can see the map there where there's a lot more women leaders now. Angela Merkel is she's probably the most powerful of the heads of state. She is the chancellor in Germany. Theresa May in the United Kingdom. Before they also had Margaret Thatcher, who was the head of state. So there are a lot of countries who are now headed by women. So you've seen some changes. And when women are in power, they do bring a different voice and advocate for policies that are better for society as a whole. But they still face the challenges, again, of a lot of resistance, like Benazir Bhutto being assassinated. Daw Aung San Suu Kyi of Myanmar not able to accept her Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts because she was under house arrest, facing challenges from within her own government. So we still have a long way to go, and it's about time the United States had a woman president. We are not there, but this year at the State of the Union, it was the very first time in history where when the president gave the State of the Union, both the Speaker of the House and the Vice President who stand behind the president were both women for the very first time in history. And then the last section talked about migration and travel. So most of the migration that's taken place is internal migration. There's a lot of urbanization happening. Most of the world now lives in cities, and a large chunk of the world population is now in urban centers. And some of these are mega cities. You can see the list here of just how many people in the area of Tokyo. 37 million people live in Tokyo. 29 million, almost 30 million in the vicinity of Jakarta, Indonesia, and Delhi, India, almost 25 million people. Okay, those are massive centers of, of population. So urbanization is associated with industrialization, right? People go to the cities to look for jobs, to be able to make a living. They leave the countryside, and that's been the biggest form of migration. So rural to urban is called urbanization. So the most urbanized societies tend to be in the western part of the world and in the northern hemisphere, northern Europe, and then Australia, New Zealand. However, a lot of the biggest centers of population that are growing are not in the they're in the what was once the developing world. That's the fastest part of the world that's growing. And then there's external migration. There's voluntary and forced international migration. And that transforms the human landscape because we move around the planet more than we've ever moved around before. There was forced migrations like you saw with the Nazis, right? When they were moving people from different countries into the concentration camps. That's a forced migration. But there have also been migrations for labor. People that travel through, that go throughout the world to work. And the more we move around and the more we interact, the more we begin to form a global identity. And traveling is one of those. So the last thing is cross-cultural travel. It's the mass tourism is the largest industry on the planet. It provides employment in a lot of countries. Cities like Rome and Paris are some of the most traveled to cities in the world. And tourism changes our attitudes about culture, about globalization. And I'll leave you with that. This being the last slide of the last chapter is travel. When you get the opportunity, travel the world because you do learn so much. You begin to see how in our country we don't have a lot of information about the world. We have a lot of stereotypes, and we often think we have a lot of egotism. We often think that we are the best country. And when you travel elsewhere and you see the way that other countries live and people live and the lifestyles, there are some good things. There are some things that are going to seem uncomfortable and awkward, but there's going to be other things that's like, wow, right? There are different ways of living that the more we travel, the more ideas we share with each other, with the world, the better we should be able to become. And so I will leave you with that. So thank you. I hope you enjoyed this chapter. And from now on, the only lectures you will have are lectures for review of the content. And these are lectures that you probably have already seen before. But now it's time to start studying for the AP exam. So I will see you all in class. Thank you.